Imagine you're trying to perfectly tune the engine of a Formula One race car. Like you are tightening the bolts down to the millimeter.
Right, checking the oil pressure, maximizing the aerodynamics.
Exactly, just trying to shave a tenth of a second off your lap time. But you are doing all of this while the car is currently going 200 miles an hour down the straightaway.
Which is terrifying to even think about.
Right. And as if that isn't enough, while you are doing all of that, you are simultaneously trying to invent like a functional teleportation device in the passenger seat.
I mean, it sounds completely impossible, but what you are describing is the exact daily reality for, well, basically any company trying to survive today.
It really is. So today we're looking at this really fascinating academic paper by Dr. Jonathan H. Westover. It breaks down this concept called organizational ambidexterity.
Yeah, it's a great paper.
And our mission for this deep dive is to figure out how the absolute top organizations manage to simultaneously do two completely opposite things. On one hand, they are perfectly refining their current everyday operations.
And on the other hand, they are radically inventing the future.
Exactly. And the secret weapon to pulling this off, the transmission mechanism that makes it all actually work, is everyday employee creativity.
It is a phenomenal piece of research, and it gets right to the heart of the modern business survival problem. What's fascinating here is that the data shows fewer than 20% of organizations actually manage to balance these two modes over a sustained period.
Wow, less than 20%. That's incredibly rare.
It's super rare, and the paper breaks this down into a fundamental structural tension. You have exploitation, which is, tuning that race car engine.
Yeah.
It is refining what already works, maximizing efficiency, standardizing processes, and just squeezing out every drop of margin. And then you have exploration.
Building the teleportation device.
Exactly, building the teleporter. That is taking massive risks, innovating, discovering entirely new paradigms, and embracing the unknown.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because whether you are managing a team right now or working in healthcare, which is a huge focus of this source material, or even if you are just trying to navigate your own personal career path, mastering this dual mindset is essentially the key to not becoming obsolete.
Absolutely. The core problem, though, is that these two modes, exploitation and exploration, are fundamentally at war with each other. The paper calls this the implementation gap.
Because they need totally different things to survive.
Right. If you look at basic resource allocation in a company, quarterly performance pressures almost always assassinate long-term innovation. Imagine you are a factory manager, right? And you have to choose between funding a project that gives you a guaranteed 2% cost reduction this quarter, or funding a wild new idea that might pay off in 5 years, or, it might just burn $1 million.
Yeah, the cost reduction wins almost every single time.
Every time.
Because the return on investment on a wild idea is basically impossible to measure in the short term, right?
Exactly. It is a measurement paradox. You can easily track throughput or track defect rates on an assembly line, but you cannot easily measure the financial value of the learning generated from a failed experiment.
Oh, totally. Which brings up the cultural misalignment, I guess.
Right, because in exploitation culture, the efficiency side hates failure. It wants 0 errors, Six Sigma perfection. But an exploration culture actively requires failure.
Because failure is the only mechanism by which you learn what doesn't work.
Exactly. And the paper uses healthcare as the ultimate high-stakes example of this tension. Think about a hospital. They must have absolute 0 errors when it comes to patient safety and administering medications.
Yeah, that is pure exploitation. Literally, lives depend on flawless execution.
But simultaneously, if that same hospital wants to exist in a decade, they have to adopt AI diagnostics, telehealth, and experimental genomic medicine, which is pure exploration.
Wait, I have to push back here. If these two cultures are so fundamentally opposed, how does an organization avoid just tearing itself apart? I mean, asking an exhausted ICU nurse to perfectly administer medications with 0 errors and then seamlessly pivot to inventing a new AI triage system sounds like a recipe for severe burnout.
It does.
How is that physically or mentally possible for one human being? Why wouldn't a company just split its workforce down the middle? Have the boring operations people in one building making sure things run on time, and the cool innovation people playing ping pong and brainstorming in another building.
Yeah, so that is the exact trap most companies fall into. They try to segregate it. But the paper argues that segregation often leads to disaster
Really? Why?
because the innovators get disconnected from the reality of the daily operations. And the operations people become highly resistant to whatever the innovators invent because they don't understand it.
Oh, that makes sense.
So to answer your question about the exhausted nurse, the paper introduces this concept of contextual ambidexterity. This is the idea that you don't permanently separate the people. The same individuals actually switch between these two modes depending on the context of the specific task in front of them. And the bridge that makes this cognitive switching possible is employee creativity.
Oh, interesting. So creativity in this context isn't just, painting a picture or being artistic.
No, right of that.
It's a specific kind of mental agility. Like, it is the ability to look at an old, boring process and find a novel way to shave 10 minutes off it, which the paper calls exploitation creativity.
Exactly.
And it is the ability to envision an entirely new care model from scratch, which is exploration creativity.
Yeah.
It is the same brain recognizing which type of creativity the current moment demands.
Precisely. It is about developing a workforce of creative problem solvers who have the contextual awareness to know when to optimize the current system and when to step back and invent a new one.
Right.
But of course, you cannot just stand in front of your employees and say, hey, be more contextually ambidextrous.
Yeah, that's going to get you a lot of blank stares.
Definitely. You have to build an organizational architecture that physically and psychologically supports it. And that is where the research introduces the AIM-O framework.
Ability, motivation, and opportunity.
That is the one.
Okay, so let's start with ability, because the paper makes it explicitly clear that traditional hiring and training have to be thrown out the window if you want this kind of contextual creativity.
Absolutely.
You cannot just hire for pure technical skill anymore.
No, you need what the paper calls cognitive diversity. You deliberately recruit people from non-traditional backgrounds who look at established problems from weird angles.
You evaluate their cultural fit for both rigid discipline and wild experimentation.
Right. And you have to train them differently once they arrive. The paper highlights the Mayo Clinic as a prime example here, and it is fascinating when you look at how it works day to day.
Yeah, tell me about that.
When they bring on new physicians, they don't just put them through the ringer on clinical excellence, the exploitation side. They simultaneously train them in innovation methodology.
Oh, wow.
They have this program called the Practice Innovation Initiative. So imagine a doctor's week. In the morning, they are doing clinical rounds, adhering to strict zero-error protocols.
Right. Lives were on the line.
But in the afternoon, they are in structured, creative, problem-solving workshops, working on real-world projects, prototyping new digital health platforms.
That's incredible.
So right from day one, their brain is being wired to maintain exceptional clinical quality while also pioneering the future of medicine.
So what does this all mean? It means you can give people the tools. You can hire cognitively diverse, smart people and train them to be mentally agile, like the Mayo Clinic does. But here is the massive roadblock.
Yeah.
How do you actually get them to care? Let me use an analogy here. Building this kind of workforce is like trying to start a campfire.
Okay, I like this.
Opportunity is the oxygen, ability is the wood, and motivation is the spark. You can have all the cognitively diverse wood in the world, but why would they stick their necks out to innovate if their year-end bonus is tied entirely to zero-defect clinical work?
They wouldn't.
Exactly. If the incentives aren't there, if there is no spark, the tools are completely useless.
That is a brilliant way to frame it. That is the motivation piece of the AIM-O framework. And it requires blowing up traditional corporate performance reviews entirely.
Because traditional systems inherently punish risk-taking.
Right. If you try something new and it fails, you get a bad review, your bonus gets cut. So to fix this, organizations have to implement dual metric frameworks.
And a dual metric framework means what exactly in practice?
It means you are evaluating employees on two totally separate scales. You assess them on exploitative efficiency, like did you hit your quarterly sales targets? Did you reduce waste by 3%?
Right.
But you also assess them on exploratory attempts. Did you pilot a new initiative even if it didn't generate revenue yet? And crucial to making this work is a rigorous failure tolerance policy.
Right, because you can't just tolerate any failure.
Exactly. You have to explicitly distinguish between a productive failure and a preventable failure.
Okay, what's the difference?
A productive failure is a well-designed experiment. You had a hypothesis, you tested a new workflow, it didn't work out. but you documented why and generated valuable learning for the company.
And you should be rewarded for that.
Yes. A preventable failure is just sloppiness. You ignored the safety checklist and the machine broke. That is negligence, and that is punished.
I want you listening to this to think about your own performance review last year. Were you rewarded just for hitting your KPI targets, or did your boss actually reward you for an experiment that failed?
Most people would probably say no.
Right, because if it is just grading you like a student on a math test, you will never take a risk. If you only grade the math score, the student keeps their head down.
Exactly.
But if you grade the math test and their willingness to raise their hand in class with a wild, untested hypothesis, suddenly you change the entire behavioral dynamic. You have to reward the attempt, not just the safe win.
Google is a fantastic real-world example of this from the research. They have a peer bonus program where employees can give small, immediate financial rewards to colleagues for creative contributions.
Wow, that's cool.
And what is brilliant about it is that it recognizes both ends of the spectrum. It rewards the person who solved a boring operational bottleneck, and it rewards the person who came up with a wild new product idea.
So they're evaluating both sides.
Yes. Their whole evaluation system is designed to prevent single-mode optimization. They are constantly signaling to the staff, hey, we value the tuning of the engine and we value the teleporter.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. We have covered ability the wood. We have covered motivation the spark. The third pillar of the framework is opportunity the oxygen.
Right.
Giving employees the time, space, and autonomy to actually be creative. But the data in the paper throws a massive curveball here.
It really does.
It turns out that opportunity-enhancing practices, like letting employees participate in decision-making or giving them flexible schedules, actually show inconsistent direct effects on ambidexterity. Sometimes it works, sometimes it does absolutely nothing.
It is highly counterintuitive.
It really is.
Yeah.
Because, wait, isn't the most famous innovation story of all time the 3M 15% free time policy?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
The one that led to the invention of the Post-it note. That is the ultimate example of giving people the opportunity and space to tinker. Why wouldn't giving people 15% of their week to just experiment automatically lead to innovation?
This raises an important question, and it is arguably the crux of the entire paper. Opportunity without ability and motivation just leads to wheel spinning.
Oh, I see.
To go back to your campfire analogy, if you pump oxygen into a room with no wood and no spark, you don't get a fire, you just get a very breezy room.
What?
If you give someone 15% free time, but they don't have the cognitive tools to innovate, and their annual bonus is still tied solely to their quarterly efficiency targets, they are just going to use that 15% free time to catch up on their emails.
Oh, wow, that makes total sense. They're just going to clear out their inbox.
Exactly. The 3M policy didn't work in a vacuum. It worked because it was part of an integrated HR system.
Which the paper refers to as system coherence.
Exactly. The practices have to reinforce each other. The paper brings up Unilever's Connected 4 growth framework to really illustrate how deep this has to go.
Okay.
Unilever doesn't just put up posters telling people to innovate. Their entire HR architecture selection, development, performance reviews, and career pathways sends one unified, coherent message.
So what does that actually look like for a Unilever employee?
It means your career path is literally a zigzag. You alternate between efficiency-focused roles, managing a mature supply chain, squeezing out margins, and venture-focused assignments, where you are tasked with launching a disruptive new product category. At Unilever, you generally cannot get promoted to senior leadership unless you demonstrate capability in both managing tight operations and driving disruptive innovation.
So you can't just slap a ping pong table in the break room, announce Innovation Fridays, and say, be creative.
No, absolutely not.
You can't just give them the opportunity if the whole overarching architecture of the company is quietly punishing them for using it.
Precisely. HR practices alone are entirely insufficient if the corporate structure or the leadership actively fights against them. Which logically brings us from the HR systems to the overarching organizational environment.
Right, the physical and structural setup. How does a company actually physically organize itself to do both things without the operations side just crushing the innovation side?
The paper outlines a few structural enablers, and it is important to understand how they mechanically work. One option is a matrix structure.
Right, explain the mechanics of that. Because matrix structure can sometimes just sound like corporate jargon. How does it physically force ambidexterity?
In a matrix structure, an employee essentially has two bosses or two distinct domains of responsibility. For example, you might have an engineer who reports to the strict, efficiency-focused head of manufacturing on Mondays, Tuesdays, and Wednesdays. During those days, their job is pure exploitation, reduce defects, speed up the line.
Got it.
But on Thursdays and Fridays, that same engineer reports to the experimental head of R&D, working on a cross-functional team designing a product that won't launch for 3 years. This dual reporting mechanism physically forces the cognitive switching into their weekly calendar.
That makes a lot of sense. It structurally mandates the toggle. And the paper also mentions modular organizations, right?
Yes. A modular organization is where you have loosely coupled units that optimize for entirely different things, but they stay coordinated at the top.
Like what?
The healthcare example here was Partners Healthcare. They realized that trying to invent the future of remote medicine inside the chaotic walls of a traditional zero-error hospital was impossible.
Yeah, the daily crises would always consume the innovation budget.
So they set up the Center for Connected Health as a totally separate modular unit.
They structurally quarantined it.
Exactly. They quarantined it so the team could explore telehealth and remote patient monitoring without getting bogged down by the daily operational demands of running the ER.
That's smart.
But, and this is the critical part, they kept the integration processes clearly defined at the executive level. So once a telehealth innovation was proven to work in the center, they had a pipeline to scale it back into the main hospital's daily operations.
But structure is really just the bones of the building, right? The paper digs heavily into the cultural foundations, specifically this psychological concept of paradox acceptance.
This is huge, and it is incredibly difficult to achieve. Paradox acceptance means treating exploitation and exploration not as a zero-sum game, not as an either, but as an ongoing dynamic balance.
So you stop looking for a safe compromise.
Right. It requires leaders and employees to stop looking for a safe compromise that waters down both sides and instead actively embrace the tension.
But to embrace that kind of tension, where you are constantly being asked to be perfect on one hand and take wild risks on the other, you need an environment where people aren't terrified of losing their jobs.
Exactly. And that is why the paper heavily relies on Amy Edmondson's foundational research on psychological safety.
Oh, I've heard of her work.
Yeah, it's brilliant. This is the biological and psychological mechanism that underpins everything we've talked about today. When employees are afraid of looking stupid or afraid of being punished for an experiment that failed, their amygdala, the fear center of the brain, literally hijacks their cognitive processes.
Wow.
When you are in a state of fear, you biologically cannot be creative. You just revert to the safest, most established routine.
Pure survival mode.
Right. So psychological safety means creating an environment where employees feel entirely comfortable admitting mistakes, asking naive questions, or dissenting from the consensus without any fear of retaliation or humiliation.
So like if a doctor at the Mayo Clinic tries a new intake process and it completely bombs,
they need to be able to stand up in a meeting and say, I broke this, here is why it failed, and here is what we learned, and receive applause, not a reprimand. If you don't have that deep psychological safety, nobody's ever going to explore.
So what does this look like for the person actually in charge, the boss?
Mm.
Because managing a team that is doing both of these things, maintaining psychological safety while enforcing rigorous standards, I mean, that sounds utterly exhausting.
It requires a very specific and quite rare type of leadership. The research calls it ambidextrous leadership.
Okay.
It is the ability of a manager to constantly toggle between two very different behavioral sets depending on what the team needs in that exact hour.
What are the sets?
You have opening behaviors where the leader encourages variation, empowers the team to challenge the status quo and tells them to experiment. And then you have closing behaviors where the leader steps in, enforces strict discipline, establishes rigid routines, and relentlessly monitors progress.
I love that concept. It is exactly like a really good film director.
Oh, so?
Well, a great director knows exactly when to tell the actors, okay, throw away the script, let's improvise, let's just play and see what magic happens in this scene. That is the opening behavior. You need that for the movie to have heart.
Right.
But that same director also knows exactly when to look at their watch and say, all right, we have to hit our marks, we're losing the sunlight, stick strictly to the script right now so we stay on budget. That is the closing behavior.
That makes perfect sense.
If you only improvise, the movie goes wildly over budget and never gets finished. If you only stick rigidly to the script, the movie is boring and nobody goes to see it. You have to be able to toggle.
That is a perfect analogy. You have to know which phase of production you are in. The paper actually mentions IBM's Cognitive Enterprise Leadership Program, which is designed to specifically train executives to recognize when to use opening behaviors and when to use closing behaviors.
So they actually train for this.
Yes. They don't just lecture them, they give them executive coaches who literally watch them manage complex projects. Projects that require both operational improvement and strategic innovation simultaneously.
Oh, wow. So real-time coaching.
Exactly. The coaches provide real-time feedback to help the leaders build the metacognitive awareness to know when to switch gears. They are training the directors to know when to yell improvise and when to yell stick to the script.
Which brings us back to you, listening to this right now. What we are really talking about here today is the fundamental strategy for surviving in a world that is just accelerating.
Yeah, it really is.
Whether you are running a massive hospital system, building a software startup, or just managing your own daily career path, you have to take a portfolio approach to your work. You absolutely need exploitative efficiency. That is what pays the bills today. You have to tighten the bolts and tune the engine of the race car. But you also need exploratory innovation. That is what ensures you actually exist tomorrow. You have to build the teleporter. And the only way to make that dual mandate work without tearing your organization or your own sanity apart is by designing a coherent system, a system that deliberately builds, motivates, and provides the opportunity for creativity.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the paper mentions the development of T-shaped professionals. These are people who have deep, specialized knowledge in one area, but also a broad, horizontal capacity to adapt and collaborate across disciplines.
Right, T-shape.
And this leaves us with a critical, perhaps even slightly uncomfortable question to consider. As organizations increasingly expect everyone to become contextually ambidextrous, to be both a reliable, zero-error operational expert and a creative, risk-taking explorer, what happens to the traditional deep niche specialists?
Oh, that's a tough one.
Think about it. In a world where artificial intelligence and automation are rapidly taking over pure exploitative, repetitive tasks, the basic tuning of the engine, does the failure to proactively develop your own personal exploration creativity mean you are engineering your own obsolescence?
That is a profound and very necessary thought to leave on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Take a hard look at your own workplace this week, or even just your own daily habits, and ask yourself, are you spending so much time tuning the engine at 200 miles an hour that you've completely forgotten to look over the passenger seat? Keep exploring. We'll catch you next time.